Hello, welcome to Spirit Universe with Adam and David, where we look at the more recent scientific discoveries along with mystical concepts to understand how we can better integrate and live in this reality we find ourselves. Today, I want to look at how plasma and other scientific concepts can be used to explain a lot of the ancient spiritual understandings and concepts that have been passed down for thousands of years. Because it turns out that our ancestors seem to have understood that we live in a much more complex reality than our modern science even suggests. And with that, let's just get into it. So the goal here is to use various scientific discoveries and rationality to provide a basic framework to begin to acknowledge that in daily life, the presence of many realms, dimensions that exist inside and outside of our own that contain vast swaths of individuated conscious entities that coexist with ourselves. So I think a great place to start would be to acknowledge that human vision is reflection based, meaning that even if we had something sitting right in front of us, if it wasn't within the visible light spectrum, we wouldn't even be able to see it. And with that, I believe that the word angel is literally trying to say that there are beings that are at an angle to us that are able to interact with us even if we're not able to see them. These beings exist in higher frequencies than what our bodies exist in, and then also at lower frequencies than our eyes can see, meaning that there's a huge range of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can't even interact with directly, although it has a major impact on us. To build on this slide shows that our eyes and ears and our sense of touch are all very limited in a narrow range. And according to NASA, our eyes can only see 0.035% of the electromagnetic spectrum. As you can see here with these various pictures of various states of the body in different emotional states, our energy is extremely volatile in different emotional states. So, for instance, with anger, it's all contained in the chest and in the head because your face really literally is turning red when you're angry. Love can be seen as a full body sensation, and happiness, much the same. Keep in mind these very narrow ranges of our senses as the universe goes from 1 hertz all the way to infinity. Which leads us to ask the question, when we're in a dark room with no external light sources, we can't even see ourselves. And I think that's something we often forget because our bodies exist in a very, very narrow range from 1 hertz to around 300 hertz. And if you remember from the previous slide, our eyes can see only in ranges 1,000 times that. These insanely this insanely high range of the electromagnetic spectrum that we see is almost like a range of frequencies that almost literally have nothing to do with us. Because if our bodies are so much slower than what our eyes see, what we're actually seeing with our eyes is what our bodies are rejecting. So not only are we only seeing reflected light that comes back to us, but we're only seeing the shadow itself. Here on the right is a picture of the aura that I've seen in the halls and the stairwell of the Theosophical Society. It's supposed to be representative of our aura, and I think it's a beautiful representation of what I'm trying to convey here. With that, I believe another thing we should really touch on is how in an observed universe, consciousness is king. And to point at this, we're going to look at the double slit experiment briefly. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the double slit experiment, but it's an experiment where they had two slits and they shot waves of light at these two slits and had a piece of paper on the back wall that was meant to record the propagation of the waves as they reached that back wall. What they found is that if they just had the paper on the back wall, you would only see the distribution pattern as if there were not two slits in the way of light. However, when they put a camera there to see what was going on, the wave propagation changed and the pattern on the back wall became exactly what you would expect it to see. Two discrete wave patterns like here on the bottom. This suggests that the act of observing changes how reality collapses. And if that's the case, what does that mean for what we're observing? And how does that impact how our reality functions? Well, to begin with that, every sensory input your body takes in is converted into electrical signals inside of your cells and then transferred into the electrical nerve endings, where it's then transferred to the brain where it's processed as discrete sensory inputs. For instance, the eyes have rods and cones that take in light, compress it, send it to the optic nerve until it reaches the visual cortex. The eyes aren't actually seeing anything. It's just the visual cortex of our brain is compiling all of that information and creating a coherent reality for us to live in. What this really means is that, well, as human beings, we often forget this. We're not actually interacting with reality, but with our assumption of what reality is. And these assumptions and expectations have a big impact on how the universe itself functions and is realized and manifests. Because there's an implosion inside of each one of our cells when they take in stimuli from the external environment. This information is taken into their core, compressed until it's only the purest information, and then shared over the different nerve endings. This process has another name. It's called implosion. And when implosion happens, there's a bit of that information that is shared across the entire universe at that moment of perfect implosion. Because not all of the energy can be perfectly transferred into the nerve endings or, a black hole. It has to be compressed, squeezed, and then distributed evenly across the medium, adding back into the medium. We'll get more into this, but just know that each one of your cells is acting as a guide and a filter for our reality. And that means that every time a cell cycles energy through itself, through whatever we call it, ATP energy or mitochondria, it's shaping the fabric of reality. Which leads us to what is even an alive body or an alive cell versus a dead one. In the medical field, they would say it's the second your heart stops beating, you've stopped breathing, or you're just dead. And this is why you often hear things, I was dead on the table for 10 minutes. So what does that mean? If people are coming back from the dead and we're saying they were dead, what does that even mean? What is life? Well, there was a study of a man who had an EEG cap on his head when he had a heart attack. And they had several men who went through this process of having an EEG cap on their head when they had a heart attack. They found that there was an increase in gamma brain waves along with alpha brain waves that suggested that just like deep meditators, when they have EEG caps on, they were having a series of visual memory recalls that were being processed and analyzed. The spiritual and so this suggests that at time of death, there is perhaps evidence to suggest that when everyone says our lives have flashed, when people say their lives flash before their eyes, they're not having a unique experience to themselves. It appears to be something built into the mammal or just all life on the planet. And they've found this in other animals as they were dying with EEG caps strapped on their heads. And the spiritual implications of this, in my opinion, is that at time of death, perhaps there is a compression and a review of all life experiences that then are transferred through the brain, through these very specific brainwaves of alpha and gamma, and then feeds back into a species-wide field. And this could also be called by people like Rupert Sheldrake, things like the morphogenic field, or as people like Dr. Michael Levin are just exploring today, the underlying voltage potentials of cellular behavior that is shared amongst the species. Because it's turning out that it's not really DNA, but rather the species is underlying energetic pattern that is passed generation to generation. And with that, I'm going to look, this is the topics we're going to generally look at in this presentation. First, we're going to look at what is fractality. Next, we're going to look at what is a plasma torus. Then, what are the difference between the different kinds of waves in the universe, transverse versus longitudinal, sometimes called scalar. With that, we'll be able to look at why do objects fall to the ground and how is that relevant to spirituality. Then we'll look at how sacred geometries, such as the Platonic solids, tie in to all these concepts. And finally, we'll look at how the concept of plasmas embedding in different bodies or inhabiting different living organisms might give us the keys to the entire universe, or as I call it, the keys to the kingdom. So first, what is fractality? Well, to put it simply, it's perfected compression, and where an individuated piece contains the whole of the universe. For example, here's some examples of fractals. Here's the Mandelbrot set and a top-down view of DNA. This self-similar set of data contains the entirety of the total fractal and an individuated shape that it contains within itself. It's an infinitely repeating pattern and shape and or equation that can repeat in the cosmos and in the microcosm. It has the ability to compress itself without any loss of information, which is an incredible feature. Here are some more examples of fractality. As you can see with the center one, the Mandelbrot set is a set of geometries that will infinitely repeat, creating these patterns. Here on the right, we can see a mountain forming from just a triangle, repeatingly, separating itself into different triangles. Another fractal shape is often called the flower of life and is very common in spiritual circles as a way to describe the way the Godhead or the ultimate creator separates itself into many pieces. This is directly connected to things like Metatron's cube, and I believe it's a description of how fractals can propagate and maintain their original shape while being connected to their ultimate whole or origin. And with that, another aspect of fractality that's often overlooked is how the golden ratio or phi ratio is the fractal ratio. Because what happens with the phi ratio, which is approximately 1 to 1.618, is that because it's always this ratio, you're always going to get a fractal shape of the previous one. And because these numbers on the right here are always going to be these values, we're always able to increase and decrease by orders of phi and always retrace where we previously were in any chain. So for instance, 1 times 1.618 on average is 2. And then that times 1.618 is 3, and so on. So you're always able to go to the next one, or by dividing by it, you're able to get the previous one. This is an incredibly unique feature of this number. And when you really stop to think about it, it makes sense that we would have one number in our universe that does allow direct division down the center repeatedly. And it's for that reason that you see this ratio represented in many things like pine cones and centers of galaxies. Another fascinating part of this is that electricity itself is fractal. If you look here on the right, you'll see that lightning bolts are spreading out in self-similar shapes and self-similar patterns. And this is a feature of electricity, or the electron as we call it, trying to find the quickest route to alleviate any pressure that it's feeling. And what's even more fascinating is that in areas where lightning has struck repeatedly, there's a repeating shape that forms all over regions that are tended to get, in regions that tend to get a lot of lightning strikes. So the scarring on the Earth will show a fractal pattern. And, well, I don't have a lot of evidence to support this right now, but things like the rickshaw pattern in Africa show a lot of evidence of being an area where lightning has struck the ground multiple times, leaving concentric rings. Another cool feature of phi ratio and its relationship to fractality, I already talked about this. This slide's out of place. So next, what is a plasma torus then? If we understand what fractality is, how does a plasma torus tie in? Well, to put it simply, a plasma torus is an electrical donut. And this geometry is what allows plasma and other energetic forces that are self-sustaining, like just the electron itself, to create a region of ionized electrons that create a mixture of free and positively charged electrons and ions. This results in a mixture of positively charged ions and free electrons. And unlike other forms of matter, plasmas are electrically conductive due to the presence of charged particles. Plasmas can be in various forms in nature, including stars, lightning, and even the auroras of the planet. It's also widely used in technology and in the industry, in fusion reactors, and even in our fluorescent lighting. Everything within a torus's influence is pulled in through its center, and then it's rotated out of the center around the outer perimeter until coming back in towards the center around the top perimeter, and then reaching the center again, where it recursively or repeatedly receives information from the previous trip around the torus and then compresses it as the current experience. This trip consists of a past, a present, and a future, because the various states of energy, whether they've been compressed, are about to be compressed, or are being compressed at this moment, all have different energy states or features. The torus makes up 99.9% of the universe, and plasma does as well. This means that when a torus is acting efficiently, it's not destroying anything when it's imploding in the center. It's compressing all that information, keeping what's relevant, and distributing what's not back into the field. But when there is a perfect compression at that center, there's a distribution of that purest information back into the totality of the field. This distribution is something that we'll look at in much greater detail soon, but just know that it's the biggest feature of these torsion fields that allow the entire universe to propagate as it does. The shape of a torus here, as you can see, is this circular shape where it goes through the center, wraps around, and goes around the outer edges. Torsion fields can be embedded within each other, meaning you can have one stacked on top of another, stacked up on top of another, and they can move in and out of each other without interfering with the totality of the shape. What this means is that, like with this one over here in the middle, on the bottom, this inner torsion field can actually become the biggest one, and the biggest one can become the smallest. And this oscillation is very unique to the torsion field and allows our bodies to do some of the unique things that they do. To briefly touch on this, if you look at the flower of life that we just talked about in 3D, you realize that the shape of the seed of life, when blown up to a three-dimensional canvas or program, becomes the 3D torus. Here is a picture of it in China with a lion-like creature holding it. This adds a completely new dimension to what the ancients knew about this shape. Because if we look over here on the right, you can see the platonic solids in relationship to Metatron's cube. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Metatron's cube, but it's said to be the shape that contains all shapes within the universe. And that is true. Because if our entire universe is composed of a torsion field, and these shapes describe a torsion field, as we see here and we'll explore soon, to me, it doesn't seem that crazy to think that the ancients understood this. One more feature of plasma that I'd like to touch on before I move on is that plasma can be in different states. They can be in what's called dark mode or glow mode. In dark mode, they're not operating with enough energy through their system that they will light up to be within that very narrow range of frequencies that we discussed at the beginning. Because to have that much energy running through them, they would be burning a lot of their energy just to maintain that glowing. However, it's a lot easier for them to be in what we call dark mode, as it's a lot less energy to be burned, and while we can't see them with their eyes, they're definitely interacting with our reality. Which is why I'm asking the question, could it be possible that fairies, gnomes, jinn, angels might just be plasma entities that are operating in dark mode? I'm going to put a graphic there. Here's a picture that describes how the torsion field can literally be mapped to almost everything in our reality, just by simply putting it over it. Another concept that ties in with these plasma toruses is the concept of standing waves. Standing waves are a fancy way of saying you got a discrete structure that contains multiple frequencies that are stacked on a single convergence point that allows for a position to appear that it's vibrating in a stable, stationary position. A standing wave can be thought of as like a note of music or vibration as it moves through a string. That self-contained wave actually is the shape of a torsion field. And it's through these interacting different harmonics of frequencies that a torsion field sustains itself, grows stronger, and can interact with this environment on a more sophisticated manner. Because when these standing waves interact with each other like different spheres in a flower of life, they can create some really complex patterns like we see in our reality. And it's these complex patterns that give rise to individuated units through constructive interference creating what we call different entities or different units of consciousness. And one more feature of these standing waves is that, as we talked with the torsion field, they can embed in each other and on top of each other without interfering or even, supporting each other through a symbiotic relationship. This is often through what we call in music theory or wave mechanics, different harmonics and octaves. So the idea is that you would have one note, like the A note, and then there would be another harmonic of that note, and then a third, and then a fourth. And all of these tones or notes are very self-similar or fractals to each other and are aligned within the electromagnetic spectrum at harmonics of octaves to each other. This means that when you look at this from a three-dimensional perspective, you see that this is exactly how the geometry of a torsion field reacts. And with that, if we remember that phi ratio is a way to drive waves or anything towards its center repeatedly, it appears that by using waves at harmonics of phi ratio, you're able to kind of cut through the noise and get right down to the base intelligence of reality. And it's for that reason that I think that the goddess named Sophia has been named that for this specific reason, because it's divine knowledge from the outer perimeter, from within the center. And because phi ratio, as we talked about, is a fractal ratio, it infinitely fractalizes itself to the center of anything. And what's really cool is that if we look back at the EEG study that we were looking at earlier when man died, the alpha and gamma brainwaves are at ratios of phi to each other, which further supports the upload and download of different information, of information from a lifetime is being uploaded to higher and lower harmonics of reality. Meaning that if a higher harmonic of reality is a higher dimension, we are directly interacting with these higher dimensions constantly. Here's some pictures of what this would look like as a fractal embedding system. Because while we'll get to it, if we look at each one of our chakras as different energetic vortexes or torsion fields stacked within each other, what we have is 7 stacked torsion fields on us that are interacting with the larger one of the Earth. And with that, we're going to revisit what happens in the center of these torsion fields when they are able to compress information in an efficient manner. What happens is that the normal up and down motion that we're very familiar with in science and ocean waves, as they reach a point where they lose their ability to move up and down, they reach a point of stillness where that energy has to be translated from this up and down, where it slowly rocks and becomes the ebb and flow back into the up and down transverse waves. In this way, they're feeding information and energy right back into the total system, creating effects that seem to defy the laws of physics as we understand them. These longitudinal waves are often called scalar waves, and they operate in a way that they stack within the transverse waves. They're the medium under which the waves move under stress. They operate in different sets of harmonics stacked on top of each other, like the previous example, giving these waves infinite amount of space to work within. You can think of these as worlds within worlds or layers upon layers. And because you're adding something back into that stack, there's a pushing, a change of that stack each time information is added to it. This literally, I think, ties back into things called pralaya or pralaya, or longitudinal, is the unmanifest, but it's still very important. That doesn't make sense. I'm going to get rid of that. And how do we get to these longitudinal waves, you might be asking? Well, the way we get to these longitudinal waves is through the meeting of two streams of energy that are constructively interfering to equally distribute information out through the field. Think of how when oceans crest on the seashore, they will come from this up and down motion, hit the seashore, and then slide up the beach and slide back into the water. While there are waves that are coming back already up and down, they grab the water and kind of ebb and flow. Here at the bottom, you can see a picture that demonstrates how this happens. As energy moves down this cone, the most impure information is lost, and only the purest information is compressed and then squeezed out the end as this longitudinal interferometry. Here's a video that I put together that shows this. As you can see, this foam slides back into the ocean, and then the waves come back, and then the foam is in the waves. This foam is literally the shape of the beach and what wasn't able to slide into the sand. Here's another example of how this happens, courtesy of Dan Winter of fractalfield.com. At the center of this torsion field, which this geometry is representing, you see there's a squeezing and then a distribution out into the longitudinal field. It happens every time a torsion field cycles through its center and implodes and then squeezes right back out into the environment. This recursive process is what is responsible for many of the spooky things that have been observed in our history. Things like teleportation, instant travel, telepathy, all have roots in the changing of vorticity from up and down transverse waves to these packed longitudinal waves. And this happens, as we discussed, when two streams of energy hit each other and twist. This happens in lightning. This happens anywhere information is exchanged with other information. Returning to platonic solids, I don't think that. So that's why there's also a correlation between how these charge points interact and how these changes of vorticity happen with the platonic solids in sacred geometry. This happens because if you take the different shapes of sacred geometry and embed them within each other, that their edges and vertices align so that they can act as waveguides for the flow of electric charge, you're able to direct the efficient collapse and fractality of the energy so that nothing is lost if aligned correctly in these platonic solid arrangements. This is because if you embed these platonic solids, which all have equidistant edges to their vertices, you're able to squeeze and compress this shape without ever losing the fundamental shape within it. This allows for charge to be, or information to be exchanged at these different spots across different bodies, planets, organisms, based on the intersection points of these different geometries. For instance, here's the Earth with a dodecahedron and icosahedron overlaid. If you look here in the center, you can sort of see actually the outline of the center of the flower of life. And then you can see there are other spheres attached to it. These different circles and triangles represent energetic hotspots where charge or information enter the planet and then gets distributed across the entire planet. Here's another picture of the different ley lines and magnetic lines as they're seen from various mapping programs that try to map the ley lines across the planet. And with that, I think we're ready to look at what causes an object to fall to the ground, or what causes gravity, or what is causing this curve in space-time that we always hear about from Einstein's equations. Well, to put it simply, and to really just kind of sum this all up, that if we remember that a plasma torus sustains itself by pulling energy in towards its center, and that these shapes, plasma toruses, compose of 99.9% of the known universe, I think it makes it undeniable that the act of a plasma torus or a torsion shape in general pulling information or electric charge in towards its center is the cause of gravity. And if you extrapolate this and understand that every single atom, particle as we call them, individuated unit, electron, all has this shape, everything in the universe is composed of gravity. The difference is how much gravity an entity has. And that comes from how much energy it's able to effectively and efficiently compress at its center before it distributes back into the longitudinal field. This happens at what many call the Planck length, as Maxwell Planck did a series of experiments where he tried to figure out what is happening inside of a black box. And he surmised that at the smallest mathematically divisible point, there is a breakdown of space-time in which things become quantized. Now, this quantization, I believe, is just another name for the longitudinal or scalar field. Because as we talked about before, when energy spirals and meets in that center, it's compressed and then distributed out into the environment. And if you look at what they're calling gravity waves, they behave in exactly the same way. Longitudinally, they undulate the environment. This undulation and the acceleration towards it is gravity. Because as you get closer and closer towards the center of something, it's going to pull you in faster and faster. Because you're at a different angle and distance from that center of implosion. This builds on an idea of Kaluza-Klein theory, which is the idea that there's a layer of space-time that compacts our reality and also kind of drives the electromagnetic forces in the universe. He suggested that actually this environment or field is probably much bigger than the Planck length, which means that we don't even have to completely efficiently collapse information or electric charge to reach these fields. It just has to be efficient. You just have to cancel out enough that it's spread into the longitudinal field. This fifth dimension of space appears in electromagnetism as 4D space, as we are trying to understand why it appears that electrons move backwards from negative to positive as opposed to positive to negative. And I believe that understanding that there's another field that is directly impacting our field, we are on the right track to understanding why. Here's some pictures to explain what I'm kind of trying to say here with gravity being caused by the implosion at the center of a torsion field. If we look here on the left with the spinning one, right here in the center, you see that as electric charge moves, or information, towards the center, it's constantly being whipped around and pulled. Imagine you were at the top of the one here and this black one. You'd fall right in the center, constantly being pulled. Same here. So if we look at the crust of the planet, we'll see that the outer crust is positively charged and the center of the planet is negatively charged, meaning that the center of the planet is constantly pulling in positive electrically charged things like ourselves or the ionosphere, which makes this planet a negatively charged planet that is slowly trying to make itself positively charged, so that when it reaches equilibrium, it starts the whole process again. Maybe this is the different yuga cycles that we see across Indian culture, or what the Mayans were thinking 2012 was going to be. A balance point for the planet and the solar system. Returning back to the Platonic solids, here is an interesting graph that shows the progress from Keter down to Malkuth as a process moving through these different sacred geometries. Because it turns out that just like the concept in the Kabbalah, that Keter will manifest as Malkuth and then repeat the pattern. This repeating pattern does fit directly on the tree of life, suggesting that even the ancients knew this information, but didn't quite understand what electric charge was. This flow, I believe, is the beginning of uniting how spirituality and science are connected by the Platonic solids that Plato has been suggesting 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And with that, I think it's a good point to look at how nature already uses these shapes. Because if you look at something like a pine cone, you'll see that there is a wrapping around at phi ratio, or around phi ratio, where this 13 spins on one side to the 8 on the other create the ratio of around phi. And this means that there's an efficient transfer of information or electric charge from the top of a pine cone towards the bottom, which makes a pine cone the perfect representation for the transfer of knowledge through mediums. This is a slide that shows that even in in the shells of atoms, you're able to find these Platonic solids. Because just as we understand, fractality means that the smallest pieces contains the whole, and the whole contains the smallest, that even atoms should exhibit these different Platonic solid shapes. And they do. Because even how electrons are shared on atoms all move through this same Platonic nest that Kepler discovered, which he believed was how the planets arranged themselves in the solar system. So we've got the solar system arranged in this. We've got atoms arranged in this. We saw the Earth was arranged in this pattern. What about us? Here's some more slides showing how they found these different shapes in different elements. Here is a hand manual of Kepler describing his different shapes and how it functions in our universe. Here is a picture showing how you can align the atomic table, periodic table, in a way that you can arrange them by different shapes. This is kind of fascinating to just kind of look at and study. This is called the Star Mother Kit by Dan Winter. It is the plastic version of how electric charge embeds within itself. Here you can kind of see how it's a network of geometries that still create the fractal shape. On this slide, I want to demonstrate how the different shapes can distribute energy depending on how many sides they have. So like a triangle, it has 3, so it's uneven. It's able to send energy. Pentagon's the same, projecting. as where squares and hexagons will kind of focus the energy in its center and allow for refinement of that energy. And finally, we're going to move on to how that works in us. On the right here, we have another fractal pattern, DNA. And what's fascinating about DNA is that it has a lot of the same features, where you can expand it, squeeze it, and it will retain its shape. But first, there's a concept known as piezoelectric force, which is when you squeeze something that is fractally spaced, it adds charge to the center or force that then gets pushed out in these geometric shapes. So that's why things like crystals can be hit and create sparks of light, because you're squeezing it in a uniform way that the charge has nowhere else to go except for out. Just as we talked about before with lightning bolts, there's a squeezing and a twisting where these two lightning bolts meet. And just like how thunder is created in the environment, where sound waves propagate outward in a longitudinal fashion, the same thing perhaps happens in our brain when we're having things like kundalini. Because have you not heard that the lightning bolt in the brain is ignited when someone has a kundalini experience? This process of moving energy up the spinal column until it hits the spark gap between the two hemispheres of the brain, as pictured here, allows for standing waves or a torsion field to get more and more force in the center of our brains until it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, creating longer longitudinal waves that propagate out into the environment. This propagation has been seen in many different ways through different studies, such as one in the 70s where they took Ingo Swann, a famous psychokinesist, and he was able to change the temperature of a thermostat contained within a Faraday cage, or a box that blocks electromagnetic signals from the outside. Based on what we know about how waves propagate in a medium, this should be impossible. And it suggested that maybe there's another form of electromagnetism that we're not aware of. And that was the beginning of us understanding how longitudinal waves actually work within our environment. Here are some more pictures of what this man, Itzhak Bentov, discovered. That he discovered in his book that if you create a standing wave within your brain and you let it propagate, it will spread into the outer environment. And you can have a lot of the mystical experiences that have been talked about throughout time. I'm going to briefly touch on this real quick, but there's a concept of if you have two waves that are intersecting in reality, and you take a third one and you shoot it towards the center, you get a fourth wave that comes back that tells you the information of all three waves. I believe that this is a big clue on how our reality works from our perspective as we take in sensory input, and how we're able to change reality at will by getting a bigger grip with our standing waves. Getting back to DNA and its fractal shape, if we look at DNA here, it looks as if the two strands of DNA are wrapped around a dodecahedron and then rotated or ratcheted. One phi ratio turn all the time. And this ratcheting of DNA not only creates a fractal shape because it's a dodecahedron and phi ratio, but it creates an infinitely embeddable system in which information is seemingly never ending. Fractality in our cells, basic DNA. As you can see here, stacking our DNA in different ways in 2D demonstrate just how incredibly fractal this building block is. It's almost indestructible. Which leads us back to that study at the beginning with what happens in a body when we die, according to that EEG study. If alpha and gamma brainwaves have been detected repeatedly in dying beings, And these brainwaves are at phi ratio to each other. This suggests that when we die, we're uploading our life experiences to a species-wide field in which the species can grow, evolve, and involve from. This acts as like a global memory system, as there's been studies that suggest that if a rat on the East Coast learns a maze, a rat on the West Coast somehow learns it faster. Or even human beings with the 100 monkey idea, where if you have 100 people in a stadium who believe something, the whole groupthink begins to change. This suggests that our DNA, while very important, isn't the total picture, and actually answers why all the other organisms on the planet have so much similarity to our DNA, because it's not really the DNA that's giving us our shape, but the underlying energetic patterns that structure our reality. And with that, I think we have a great place to move forward on any of these topics from a better understanding that not everything talked about in spirituality is woo, but rather just misunderstood from the perspective of modern science. It's through understanding these things that humanity is going to be able to move forward and rediscover what we had already known in the ancient days of times like when Egypt was prospering, or Sumer was just beginning to make statues and have culture. I believe this might even go back to Atlantis or Lemuria. Because when we start to understand that plasma is 99% of the universe, we can start to understand that a lot of the energy in our bodies is immortal plasma that will exist beyond the grave. And with that, I believe we can actually start to understand what people see as shadows or dark figures. They're just plasmas in dark mode. They're probably your ancestor or a spirit that you knew from a previous life, or even an angel. Because why would you put out all this energy if you didn't have to? I wouldn't. And with that, thank you for watching. My name is Adam David. I hope this presentation has been enjoyable for anyone who's watched it. I'm probably going to clip this up and put it up on my YouTube channel. But anyone who's watched this, thank you. And if you enjoy my work, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and maybe checking out my Patreon. I have some really, really big plans for how to take this moving forward, because I realize that this is incredibly powerful. And there's a lot of people out there that would really benefit from understanding that they're not crazy. They're just things they can't see in front of them. Thank you again. My name is Adam David.